Where's my sign? By the way, the other side has been tearing down our signs at every conceivable opportunity. They're really a slimy bunch. I mean, but they want to raise your taxes. What do you expect?
Thank you very much, Lance. In the third quarter of last year, I got a notification that we had a fairly sizable donation, I won't say how much, from someone that I'd never heard of. So the first thing I did was hit Google. Found out a little bit of information. In January of this year, I had an opportunity, after I had found out a little bit more about this somewhat anonymous donor. I had a name, and that was really all I had to go by. I did a little bit of research, found out as much as I could about him, and gave him a phone call to thank him for a fantastic donation to the party. In January, we had the opportunity to sit down and go to lunch. This was one of the first things that I did as executive director of the Libertarian Party of Georgia. Was sit down with Principal and Pate LLP, and through my research, I found out that he was a founding member of the Georgia Innocence Project. That was something that I was very interested in as somebody who's not supportive of the death penalty. I just wanted to give a little bit of background as I introduce our next speaker, who will be speaking about criminal justice and decriminalization of marijuana, Mr. Pate.
Thank you, brother. It really wasn't that much money. And hopefully we can do better next year. Thank you for letting me be here today. This is my first Libertarian Party convention, and I am certain but I am certain that it will not be my last. It is so good to see that there are people who are truly committed to less government and more personal liberty in the state. I have been to many political gatherings, but I have never felt as truly at home as I have today. Brett is right. I am a founding member of the Georgia Innocence Project, but that doesn't mean I started the Innocence Project. There were a number of people who got together back in 2002 because we saw a need. There had been a national Innocence Project as early as 1992, and they had had a lot of success. Now, the mission of the Innocence Project is simple. We want to take innocent people and get them out of prison. Doing that can be fairly complicated, but not the way we focus on. The Innocence Project can only take cases where there is DNA evidence that has been preserved. And you would be surprised how many cases, especially 10, 20 years ago, where they had access to DNA evidence, but they didn't test it. We have a lot of people who are currently in prison in this state and in other states who are serving time for crimes they did not commit. The Innocence Project doesn't really take an advocacy position on the death penalty, but we do take a strong position on having innocent people locked up for something that they didn't do. We can talk about liberty all day long, but that's really where the rubber meets the road. When you have somebody serving a sentence of 20, 25 years for something they didn't do. What we've done over the past 10 years or so has focused our attention on the problems that we see in the criminal justice system in Georgia. We have only been able to help 7 individuals so far, but those 7 individuals have a lot in common with many other folks that we haven't been able to get to yet. I'll give you an example. One of our earliest exonerees had served a 25-year sentence for a crime that he did not commit. There was a witness identification in that case that was flawed. The police did not press the investigation. They didn't spend time on it. The crime lab didn't do its job. And so that man was convicted. And think about this. Every day, 25 years, you're sitting in prison and you're wondering, does anyone realize that I didn't do it? Does anyone care? And that's where we saw a need. And I'm proud that I'm involved with it. It's certainly been a rewarding experience, but it can also be kind of frustrating and depressing because I'm a criminal defense lawyer. That's my day job. So I see every day, every week, that we still have some of the very same problems in Georgia right now that they had 20 and 25 years ago. And in some cases, it's much worse. Like many other problems, and we've heard several speakers talk about money and taxes and the lack of adequate funding or too much funding, the problem in the criminal justice system is not the lack of money. We've got plenty of money. It's how we're allocating that money. About 20, 25 years ago, the people in this state decided that we were going to get tough on crime. And that sounds great. Politically, it sounds fantastic. Got a lot of people, a lot of votes. The problem was, no one told these folks, you need to distinguish what crimes we're talking about. Is it just armed robberies, rapes, murders, aggravated assaults? Or are we also talking about drug offenses? Because as a result of that push back in the early 90s, we now have mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. And the result of that policy is that we in Georgia are locking a whole lot of people up in prison that don't belong there. And I'm not just talking about innocent folks. I'm talking about people who have been convicted of nonviolent criminal offenses, a lot of drug offenders who are serving time and at a very costly rate to us, the taxpayer. Let me give you some figures. We currently spend approximately $1 billion, that's billion with a B, on locking people up in Georgia every year. Most of that money goes to corrections. That's the physical prisons, the guards at the prisons, the food for the inmates, the health care for the inmates, and it also covers probation officers and parole officers. $1 billion a year. Now, what's the result of that kind of spending and that kind of policy? Georgia right now has the highest incarceration rate in the country. The highest. 1 out of every 13 individuals in this state is currently serving a sentence in Georgia. 1 out of 13. It's not just a little bit higher than most states. It is double the national average. And to put it in perspective, New York, a state that has twice the population of Georgia, over 19 million people, they have the same number of inmates in their prisons that we have here in Georgia. Now, I know Georgia is kind of a dangerous place, but it's not twice as dangerous as New York. But yet we have the same number of inmates. And this is not something that has been building up over a long time because we've had such a bad crime problem in this country or this state. There's been a 5-fold increase in the number of people that we've been locking up since 1985. 5-fold. And it's not just that we're locking up more folks, we're keeping them there for longer. Let's look at drug cases specifically. Back in 1990, the average sentence for a drug offender in a Georgia prison was 10 months. Today, it's more than double that. It's 21 months. We're locking up average people who have been convicted of drug possession, possibly drug purchase, drug transactions, and we're keeping them in prison at taxpayer expense for approximately 21 months. Now that may sound like, well, it's no big deal. It's not a whole lot of time. We're still talking less than 2 years. But the statistics will tell you this, that for every 2 months we hold inmates longer, it's costing us about $18 million a year. Think about that. For every 2 additional months, if you apply it to all these inmates, that's a tab of $18 million. That's a lot of money. And the fact is, that really is just the money that we're spending on prisons. We are also spending an incredible amount of money building new jails in all of our counties right now. And there is still a jail overcrowding problem. And again, people may say, well, who cares? Let's just stack them on top of each other, keep them like sardines. Even though federal law doesn't allow that, people may say, we really don't care about the conditions in a jail. But let me tell you what you do care about. You care about keeping track of violent offenders, and that is not happening right now. Anyone who has watched the news this past year heard about the Georgia State Trooper that was killed in the line of duty. And he was killed by an individual who was released from Fulton County Jail who had a prior record for violent offenses. Any other situation, that individual, who I think had also violated his conditions of bond, would have been locked up, would have still been in jail. But he wasn't. He wasn't because they flat out don't have room to keep everybody who's facing punishment right now in Fulton County. I've got a personal example. Our firm represented 2 different individuals, one in Fulton County and one in DeKalb County. And these folks were charged with some pretty serious crimes: armed robbery, aggravated assault, use of a weapon in connection with an armed robbery and aggravated assault. We went before the judge to try to get them out on bond. No, bond denied. Dangerous felon, we're not letting him out of jail. We go back to the office the next day for work. We get a call from the client who's at home, who had been released by the jail by mistake. Just let him out. Fortunately, we only represent good, honest people. So he called our office the next morning and said, look, I don't know what happened, but they told me I couldn't stay there any longer, and they told me to leave. We went back to the judge and we said, Judge, please, would you tell the jail this time to keep him in custody because we don't want to get in trouble if he's let loose again. And it sounds kind of humorous, and I guess it is, but the reality is we don't keep track of violent felons very well in this state or in this system because we've got too many people going through the system. Too many people. Let's look at another area of cost for Georgia, crime labs. Now that's one of the reasons the Innocence Project got started. We found that the crime labs in this state were not doing an effective job of analyzing scientific evidence, doing good forensic examinations. And it's no wonder. Most of the crime labs in our state are dedicated to looking at drugs. Because every single drug prosecution that you have in Georgia, you have to have a chemist analyze the substance to, number one, determine if it is in fact a drug, and two, what is the quantity. So we've got all this state money tied up in hiring chemists to look at drugs to tell us what we already know, that they're in fact drugs. And so the DNA samples are sitting on the shelf. But we're spending all this time and money looking at this little amount of marijuana in some cases. Also remember, for every drug prosecution, guess what else you need? You need a lawyer. And unfortunately, all those folks can't come hire us. So that means that the majority of people, and it is true, it's a majority of people facing these charges, they have to get court-appointed counsel. Guess who pays for court-appointed counsel? We all do. The reason they're entitled to that is because someone facing a drug charge in Georgia, even if it's just a misdemeanor quantity of marijuana, I don't mean to hold my finger like this one, but even if it's a misdemeanor quantity of marijuana, we're still talking about possible jail time, possible prison time. And that means you're entitled to a lawyer at taxpayer expense. And that's another reason that the Innocence Project got started, is because we realized that there were a lot of cases, very serious cases, death penalty cases, other murder cases, where lawyers were not doing a competent job in representing their client. And it's no wonder. They have 300, 400, 500 in some cases, files at a time. The majority of those files, drug crimes, drug cases. So, what is the solution? One of the things that I noticed from being in court literally every week is that if you walk into a criminal court building, any criminal courts in the metro area, you're going to see about 100 people waiting to have their case heard that day. Approximately 100. Some it's more, some it's a little less. And it's not going to be the first time they've been there. Most of those folks have had to come back to court month after month after month, some year after year after year. And if you look around and you look at the docket, and everyone gets a docket that shows you what the name is and what their charges are, you'll see that a third to a half, 1/3 to 1/2 of the people that are waiting to see the judge in a superior courtroom, a felony criminal courtroom, they're there for drug charges. 1/3 to a half. We are spending so much of our money prosecuting drug crimes that we don't have the resources to focus adequately on violent crimes or even property crimes. And so you may think, well, who cares? If there's a lot of people in the court, they'll eventually get to them, we'll process them like any other case. Well, the fact is they don't. Let me tell you what I mean by that. This year alone, there have been 7 cases where the state Supreme Court threw out a murder charge, because the state had violated the Speedy Trial Act. They didn't take them to court in enough time. Murder cases, dismissed, thrown out. Now, why can't the state try murder cases in a timely manner? It's because they got 300 to 400 people sitting there on drug charges waiting to see a judge, and they have constitutional rights too. So, crowded court dockets do affect us. Money on crime labs, it's out of your pocket. Money on indigent defense lawyers, out of your pocket. Money to build prisons, jails, out of your pocket. Can we do anything about it? I feel somewhat like maybe I'm preaching to the choir when I tell you that the war on drugs in Georgia is costly and it's ineffective. But that's not going to end today, and it's not going to end tomorrow. There is a proposal that makes sense to me and to a lot of other folks that would at least start to address this problem. It wouldn't fix it overnight, but it would address the problem and be a step in the right direction. And that's decriminalization of marijuana. I'd like to take credit for it as my idea, but it's not. It's been around with us for a long time. In fact, there are about 13 states now that decriminalize marijuana. And we're not talking about just California, Oregon, and some northeastern states. We're talking about North Carolina, and believe it or not, Mississippi. Do you realize it's not a crime in Mississippi to possess a misdemeanor quantity of marijuana? It's simply an ordinance violation. You pay a fine at the window and you go home. Now, if Mississippi can do it, I believe we can do it as well. And I think we can go further. I think there is enough interest in the public now, and perhaps enough political willpower, to say, let's decriminalize all marijuana. The only objection to that would be from some folks who say, look, we've still got to prosecute the drug dealers. Those are the guys we have to go after. We still have to prosecute them. But let me tell you something. If someone drives up I-85 right now with a tractor-trailer load of marijuana, they're going to be prosecuted. They're going to be prosecuted on the federal level. See, the feds have always been smart about this. It's illegal to possess any marijuana under federal law, but they don't go out and charge everybody with it. They don't bring them into court, and they certainly don't put them into their prisons. What they do is what we should do on the state level, and that's exercise some discretion, some common sense. Is a person who has a joint or even a small bag of marijuana really worth our taxpayer dollars to prosecute him and to jail him, to feed him, to clothe him, to care for himself, to do everything that we have to do? Is it worth it? Does it make sense? And what has amazed me this year is other people are starting to see that too. I would have never believed that I would see a Republican governor, a Republican Speaker of the House, a Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court stand in our Capitol and say, you know, we're not so sure that we want to spend this much money locking up drug offenders. Right. But it's great that they've said it. At least now we can start having a reasonable, rational conversation about it. But what's going to be missing from that is any political advocacy of it. I mean, we cannot really expect the Republican Party to get behind decriminalization. There are too many social conservatives in that party to ever do it. It won't happen. We can't expect the Democrats to do it because, frankly, they are so afraid of being perceived as soft on crime or soft on anything that they won't take a stand like that. To me, that presents a great opportunity to this party. You're looking for a statewide issue, you have a statewide issue. You're looking for people to listen and pay attention, they're listening, and they want somebody to talk to them about something that makes sense for a change. They're tired of spending all of their money on something that doesn't harm them personally. They're ready, and they're willing. And I think if this party brings forward this message, really gets behind it, becomes its advocate, the party can receive more attention. More attention means more members, more money, and then ultimately more votes. Because ultimately, I think that's why we're all here. Thank you. Anyone have any questions? Sure, I'm sorry. We're running a little bit behind.